It's 1 minute for the time we were scheduled. I will start right away. Okay, so let's do it now. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who could join us today in this session. It is a pleasure to start this conversation on, let me just find, on automating decision-making, discrimination, and the internet. This session is organized by Derechos Digitales, which is an NGO, civil society organization based in Chile, operating in Latin America, trying to foster and promote human rights in technological environments. We have observed a growing trend in Latin America towards the use of automated decision-making systems based on intensive data collection and processing to control access to public services and social rights, or to legitimate state interventions in contexts of social vulnerabilities. Even in the absence of proper regulation or policy debates, countries in the region have promoted the adoption of these types of systems at the public administration level, for instance. An initial mapping developed by the Derechos Digitales Cyber Policy Center identified 20 projects for the use of ADM systems to allegedly enhance state efficiency in responding to challenges in areas such as health, childcare, education, public security, access to justice, immigration, labor, transportation in several Latin American countries. Most of them, under a rhetoric of promoting social good, try to target particularly vulnerable groups, exposing them to interventions that usually they are not able to consent with. They have no autonomy regarding their participation or possibility to appeal to decisions made based on information that they don't control. And in that sense, they make particularly vulnerable populations even more visible and vulnerable to state interventions. At the same time, it seems that this may imply a differential treatment on how people exercise their fundamental rights, including but not only their right to privacy. This session aims at discussing some of these issues by analyzing how automated decision-making systems are being actually used in the region. And we have a very special group of experts here to discuss this with us, who are dedicated to deeply investigating regional trends regarding the use of AVM systems and produce evidence on its potential impacts and opportunities. Each of them will react to 3 questions we've prepared, and then we will open the floor for the audience's questions and comments. The questions we have invited them to comment are: first, which are the trends that you observe in relation to the use of automated decision-making systems in your country or in the Latin American region in general? How these initiatives have impacted or may impact in the exercise of rights by affected populations, particularly the most vulnerable ones? And finally, which good practices do you observe or believe should be adopted to mitigate risks in the implementation of these systems, considering the particularities of the Latin American context? I will start by inviting Carolina Aguirre from the San Andres University in Argentina to share her thoughts on this. She'll have 15 minutes, and then we'll open for the other participants. And thank you, Carolina, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. I must say that one of the problems we have when we address this issue in Latin America is how opaque, and how the lack of accountability and the difficulty in accessing this kind of information around the practices of automated decision-making technologies in different processes. And the context of the pandemic has not helped in that respect. So maintaining social distancing measures, the inability to interact, or to if one has contacts in government, or to get to understand why certain policy is being developed, etc. I mean, with the users of technology. I mean, in certain very critical or sensitive areas, it's very difficult to do proper research in that respect. So I have to say that a lot of what of the freshest information I've seen is coming more from in this year in particular, but I mean, traditionally in this respect, it's coming from civil society. It's coming from actors around this table. So the kind of work I am actually doing or engaging with respect to the expansion of algorithmic usage in Latin America is mainly centered in the public sector, as Jamila was mentioning previously. So although we have we have a burgeoning private sector who is using these technologies. The evidence we have is that these are mostly fintech companies, firms that are still, I mean, not providing services to the wider populations, although we might see or we can see some kind of credit scorings and insurance policies developing this. But again, this is extremely confidential, business sensitive. So in this respect, we might and we will be seeing more of this in the region. But in particular, my focus has been on the public sector. And it comes as no surprise that the colleagues from Algorithm Watch were developing earlier today, that it's facial recognition technologies that are having, I mean, this greatest impact in some of the public policy debates. And unfortunately, despite, and this is something that I was I would say slightly embittered, despite the fact that civil society has been working regionally to stop the advance of this process in several of the largest urban sites in the region, such as Buenos Aires, for example. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the city finally approved the use of facial recognition technologies in the metro of the city. Understanding, I mean, having been a paradigmatic case where civil society from all the region and even international NGOs were advocating and signaling the real problems that this technology has in its application, particularly because it's not a robust technology as such, and it really comes as a surprise, considering, I mean, maybe not as a surprise, but I mean, it's on the one hand, we have a government, a national city government that is very embracing technologies at all levels, and it's even embracing a city discussion on an AI strategy for the city of Buenos Aires. It's quite incredible that they are not being able to understand the implications of these measures. And again, I mean, this is a trend. I mean, this is a trend that on the one hand, we see a lot of resistance, and we see many particular states in the United States that have suspended, created moratoriums for these kind of technologies. And but on the other hand, we are seeing this emerging trend even in Europe in the context of the pandemic. So it's something to watch. It's something to be on the alert, and it's something that in terms of when one thinks about the practices of and I'm combining a bit the questions, I mean, and the responses to some of the questions, but when one thinks of how to act upon this, I mean, it's here we have to be very cautious, I mean, in terms of the resistant campaigns that were mounted over the last 2 years, and with other cities, like for example, the city of Sao Paulo earlier this year. coming and the networking efforts from civil society in that respect, they seem to show some small partial victories, but then we are not seeing the actual policy changes that we would like to see. On the other hand, the wish-washing attitude of governments of using the tool of national AI strategies. I mean, I'm not saying that they are that they are not genuine and sincere efforts in trying to build a multi-stakeholder effort around ethical principles and a multi-stakeholder development of a national AI strategy. But then on the other hand, how are these national strategies having any kind of effect on these kind of policies? So unfortunately, some of the claims and the ideas behind the workshop, this roundtable session that we're having now, are being actually corroborated by some of the facts that we are beginning to see. Policing efforts are also relying on some of these technologies in some parts of the continent. I mean, but again, in this context, I will defer to my colleagues from civil society, and I'm sure among the participants, some colleagues will want to bring in this experience with respect to how these measures are being used against indigenous communities and marginalized groups. And again, the gap that we have in terms of the development of these technologies in the region, it's the black box approach to both how these technologies are selected by governments, how these technologies are then fed with the concrete data is something that not even using the legal instruments that one can have, such as the Freedom of Information Acts in many of the countries in the region. We have that tool. We are not receiving any kind of response as to why this is happening. So again, there is an appetite. There is this techno-solutionism that we have seen in governments as well, related with the COVID-19 apps, which is another another strategic area which it's not just the merit of of Latin America in terms of being one of the early champions in terms of practically every country having more than one app during the first 3 weeks of the announcement by the WHO of the pandemic. But now again, we are seeing how this, the ideas around the solutions that these technologies can bring about, and the concerns related with privacy, surveillance, but also with cybersecurity risks that are really generating a bottleneck for local companies. And this is some kind of evidence from a couple of countries in Latin America who I talked to, some of the companies involved in the development of these apps, is that they were really feeling that if they would have a breach, then there would be a great amount of sensitive information being released. So these kind of apps and this kind of solutionism that emerged from the possibility of contact tracing apps early on in the pandemic, and which have been refined in later versions, and in most cases now with a backbone comprised by the API from Apple and Google, is something again that we have seen in the region, but not only in the region. Again, it's the region is not divorced from other realities. And finally, one of the other areas that we are, and at the center where I'm based in Argentina, conducting research, is upon the idea of judiciary modernization regarding the use of artificial intelligence technologies, broadly understood. Okay, so from expert systems to machine learning and automated automated large data sets for automated decision making processes. We are not seeing that in general the region is going from the stage of the research we're in 5 countries. We are not seeing the region evolving into the adoption of AI to let's say to automate the role of judges in court rulings. We are not saying that this is the kind of motivation behind this, but we are definitely seeing the need to, a real claim to modernize one of the region's most weak spots. And in the region, I'm sorry, we have some of the countries with the lowest indexes of transparency, efficiency in the delivery of justice. And what we are seeing here again is a need to, or the appetite to incorporate these technologies with the idea of modernization. So again, this is early on in the process. Some countries such as Brazil have really made a great leap forward in this respect, and we will have to see what happens to others, and where the judiciary is much more fragmented, and some of the claims that precisely the Brazilian judiciary has developed over the last year is that they have actually managed to achieve some consolidate some information in a way that is helping some of the most ordinary cases related with pensions and questions regarding retirement schemes, etc., for the judiciary to be more aligned amongst the different states. So here we see there is a desire to incorporate this, but again, we are not seeing we are seeing policies that are following this trend, but we are not seeing this automated courts, and we are not seeing judges who are willing to give away their role to an algorithm. So in that respect, we are not treading in dangerous paths, I would say. I think I still have a couple of minutes, but I will leave it open because I'm seeing some questions and comments on the chat, and people, they're participating. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. I guess in your last comments, you brought 2 interesting tensions that we observe in the region. In one hand, you have like the inefficiency of traditional institutions like the justice systems in several of our countries, and on the other hand you have this narrative around how efficient these automated systems could be, but at the same time we know that they add a new layer of opacity probably to something that is already a black box. And another interesting thing that you mentioned in the end is this tension between this narrative and some kind of pressure for automation and the resistance that traditionally established powers like judges in this case could represent to this advance. Thank you, and thank you so much for all the comments and the very interesting insights that you bring to this table. I will invite now Victor Saavedra from De Justicia, a civil society organization based in Colombia. He will comment a bit on these questions that I already mentioned, a bit on the trends, the challenges for vulnerable populations, and what he sees in terms of possible developments and best practices. And I know Victor has a special knowledge on the implementation of automated decision-making systems in the justice system. So maybe if he wants to jump into this debate also is very welcome. Thank you so much, Victor, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are, and thank you for being with us today, and thank you also Derechos Digitales for inviting me today. I would like to begin with some sort of autocritic to civil society being part of it. I mean, when we talk about automatic decision making, we are talking about something very complex that takes part into an ecosystem with multiple actors, multiple technologies, uh, differences between countries, within countries. So I believe there are like 3 levels of how this complexity is being faced. If you take a look to academic papers analyzing the impact of these systems, which are quite difficult sometimes to understand, they are very broad and very detailed on what they are talking about. On civil society, we have some sort of tension because we have to be both academic but make advocacy. And that tension is where my critic lies, make us sometimes put the light on certain type of algorithm, not all of them, or systems, not algorithms, systems. So we usually analyze uh, police systems, justice systems, facial recognition, uh, natural language processing when we are talking about justice sometimes, not all of them. And we take for granted that the complexity of the issue is known by the public debate itself. So my first call would be to be aware of that gap between what we may know in civil society, or what we think we know in civil society, and what we put forward on the public debate, in order to not render invisible some phases of the debates. And why I say this, because the other side, the public authority that is developing and deploying the system, is not going to make it complex for public debate. And Carolina just pointed it out. The narrative of enthusiasm, this system is the solution and is going to solve it. So when that message is put on the public debate, it is to us to make the two functions, that is to criticize it and to provide with the complexity of this topic. Because if we only focus to artificial intelligence, we have the broadness of digital technologies in there. And when we denounce, we have to be clear or specific if we are denouncing a certain system or a certain use of AI, or all of AI as a broad. And this is not something that is so certain. I mean, we have, for instance, the criminality prediction systems, Predpol, and so on, that are being criticized as an use of AI. They are being criticized as a use because the data is not reliable enough for any certain system to be not risky enough. Whereas other systems are criticized because of their details, their deployment, and maybe another use with a different system, a different name may be useful. I can make an example with this very, very easy. I just read last week, I'm just checking it out on my other screen, an article that said there is this algorithm which is racist, and because of this racist algorithm, Black people is not getting a kidney transplant. And that's a very particular way of saying something. Whereas if you read the article and the two scientific articles that that are commented, what happens is that there is on the medical field a debate of the risk of using ethnic pertinence as a tool to diagnosticate and to treat the risk, but also the usefulness. And they are not agreeing on how to face this tension. And this is the tension that lies in the piece of news that just says there is a racist algorithm avoiding Black people to getting a kidney transplant. What happens in practice is that one of the measurements of kidney diseases takes into consideration a modification on the values depending if you're a woman or a man, or you are from this ethnic, racial ethnic group or the other, and this comes with some history. So it's more complex than this kind of commonplace messages. But once the self-critic is done, let's jump into what Carolina was pointing out. Too much enthusiasm, techno-solutionism, and what she just said about the pandemic happens as well in Colombia. In the first 2 months, we had tons of digital technology initiatives to contact tracing. One of the country that changed a lot throughout time. They had contact tracing by Bluetooth. They had to take it out. They had to put it back with a different system. We had one using ad IDs from Google in the Department of Antioquia. We have difference in Medellin and in Bogota. We have multiple administrations from different levels of powers putting forward multiple solutions that overlap, by the way, and that have different impacts on privacy and rights. And this is part of this techno-solutionism of, I want to act and act now. And I think it would be nice to make a comparison on different regions, the timing of these deployments and the changes that had to be made throughout time because of such a rush. And about the same idea, I think something that is quite complex and that is happening right now is the reversal of the logical decisional process. I mean, when we think about this kind of systems, the chronological order should be, in my point of view, to define and characterize a problem in reality I want to engage with, and then analyze the alternatives and maybe find out some sort of technology is interesting to engage and improve such a situation. Whereas what is happening now, in my belief, is a reversal on this process. So we have digital technologies we are eager to use, and then we need to find a problem and a justification for it. And this leads to one recommendation that is regarding what Carolina said as well, transparency. Transparency not only on the systems and how they work, the variables and data they are using and how they are using it, but also the decisional process, how we reach the decision to use such a system. And why is that? Because only by analyzing the decisional process can we assert if inequalities in the country were taken into consideration and how to mitigate them, if issues on the data available was taken into consideration and how those situations are being faced if it were the case. The analysis of capabilities within the public entity itself, because many of these times the system is just bought or implemented without any kind of analysis on the impact on the organization itself, on the public organization itself. And this kind of techno-enthusiast narrative in the public sector, to which, as I said, I think more transparency should be promoted, lives together with other two situations that are rendered invisible because of this enthusiasm. First, those deployments that are being developed without so much enthusiasm and pieces of the news and messages kind of, we are going to solve this issue. And this happens. We have some initiatives in Colombia that are being developed slowly, chaining pilots. We have a pilot, we have an evaluation, we have another pilot. We have local people, local capabilities being taken into consideration in the development itself. We have the academia making part of these developments, and these developments are not commented in the public. So they are not part of the public narrative of this enthusiasm. And second, they render invisible as well other phases as I said before, of artificial intelligence in which local capabilities are being developed. And as a simple example, there was this event in April called Women in Data Science Bogota, in which you had many women presenting advances in AI for medical fields, recognizing instruments, helping developing a policy of the tries of the proofs of COVID when we have low resources, and those disappears from the public debate also because of this enthusiasm. And from this, I would like to jump into the idea that we need to bridge we need to bridge the knowledge of our own with the development of these kinds of systems. As I said, as Carolina said before, we need to keep improving our knowledge in Latin America about these systems, but we have knowledge that is useful. We know that our countries are unequal in many phases. They are diverse within the country and within the region. And we know they are diverse as well in the capabilities of the public sector in our countries. And this has to be taken into consideration when we are making a development and a deployment of these systems. So there is this kind of gap between what we know, diversity, and what we put forward as a reality when deploying these systems, which is mainly the white guy, medium class of the capital mainly. And in order to be wrapping up, I would like to link this with the importance of data itself and propose to take us a step back. Instead of seeing these systems, seeing the importance of data in the terms that these systems work in a continuum between two stages of reality. So we have the reality we want to impact, and we formalize and modelize it. And we develop the algorithms, and we develop those algorithms with the data we have as a reflection of our reality. And then we have the ending in which the system brings an output, and that output has to be interpreted by a person to make an impact on reality back. So even if we don't take a look at the systems themselves, those 2 points in which reality gets formalized and from formalization we get back to reality have to be taken into consideration when public entities engage in this decision. And in practice, this means two things. One, to be aware of what our data says of our reality. And there is an interesting article called Taxonomy of Dirty Data that says that we may have missing data that is directly wrong, or data that even if it's not wrong, is unusable. And this has to be taken into consideration with our pen and paper before writing any line of code. And on the other side as well, we have to develop capabilities so the person that is interacting with the system knows what the system is saying and what it's not saying, and what can be done with the system and cannot be done with the system, taking into consideration the context we are living in. So to wrap up the idea of taking from the idea of the transparency with Carolina, transparency also in the decisional process, from the idea of enthusiasm, just lowering down the expectation and contextualizing it with our own knowledge, producing more knowledge and taking into consideration what we know. As a good practice, I would like to put forward the example of the crime prediction system in the police in Bogota. It's still a pilot. We cannot make final conclusions about it, but how the decision is being taken is interesting, because we have academia, local academia developing the models, local industry developing the models, and from time to time they make public events explaining the algorithms they are taking into consideration, the models, and how they are changing them to face the different complexities in reality they are finding. So that's just to say we have also nice and interesting examples to take into consideration.
Excellent, Victor. Thank you. Thank you so much for your explanation and for these provocations that you bring in that I think would be very interesting to hear, not only from this roundtable, but also from participants, their thoughts around the role of civil society in producing information and documenting and researching this and these tensions that you mentioned. And at the same time, I think the point that you make in the end regarding challenging the fact that data will reflect the reality is key for what we are trying to discuss here. And when you talk about transparency, I think transparency regarding how data is collected, how data is processed, is definitely something that is also part of this big problem, and it's particularly invisible in some of these debates. I should have mentioned this before, but I will do now before I introduce our next panelist. Well, Derechos Digitales is dedicating at this moment to the development of some in-depth research regarding case studies in 4 different countries in the region and the implementation of automated decision-making that are being led by the state, being the state itself, the state in partnership with academia, state in partnership with private sector, local private sector, international private sector. Victor and De Justicia are leading a case study in Colombia, and Patricio Velasco, who is our next panelist, my colleague in Derechos Digitales, is coordinating this research, and we'll talk a bit more about it and some of the trends that we observe, and also react to the questions that I pose. So thank you, Patricio, for joining us today, and also the floor is yours now.
Hello, can you hear me well? Thanks. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for being here. So yeah, like Yamila was telling us, we are currently working on Derechos Digitales in a comparative study based in 4 cases, each on different countries in the region. The objective of these case studies is to critically evaluate the development and implementation of public policies that use automated predictive processing technologies. This study is part of a greater research and advocacy strategy led by Derechos Digitales in cyber policy issues. So this research has allowed us to have direct knowledge on the way of the way in which this type of technology is being used currently in the region. Something that until now was quite hard to understand because most of the implementations are still recent or in its pilot phase of training, so therefore they are still largely undocumented. This experimental aspect of the use of automated decision-making in several Latin American countries has some implications on the trends that I will mention now regarding the use of these technologies in our region. Even though this work is currently in progress, and I want to highlight that, it is possible to identify, I will say, 3 key elements that may shape preliminary trends regarding the use of ADM at the public sector in the region. Firstly, I would like to say that the use of these technologies can influence the institutional configurations. And I think that this is something that both Carolina and Victor have already mentioned. Contrary to what might be expected, many times the proposals for technological resolutions precede a clear diagnosis of what to improve through the implementation of such devices. That is, the various technological developments and their use can configure the public policy problem to be solved, accounting for the performative nature of these technological devices. Thus, institutional development arises around the system and not around the problem that it seeks to resolve. This is something that already Victor had mentioned. And this, we already know, has multiple and significant implications, not only for the design of the policy, but also for its further evaluation. This can also be understood under the argument made by Evgeny Morozov that we have already discussed regarding techno-solutionism. So I think that we have one key issue there regarding how these policies and these technologies can actually affect institutional configurations. The second point, we think that there is a clear difficulty in accessing information on the way in which these technologies are being used nowadays. There is a kind of a double non-transparency. On the one hand, there are the difficulties in knowing the deployment and implementation of these public policies, difficulties that can be explained, and we all already know about them, by the lack of effective and proactive transparency policies in the region. While on the other hand, there is the built-in opacity, this black box of this type of technological solutions, which require a specialized approach to specifically describe the operation of the technological devices, their uses, and their effects on the implementation in their policies. So in the second point, I think that it's important, the whole thing regarding accessibility of information that we all have already discussed. Thirdly, I think that the last important trend that I can see on this is regarding the implementation of this type of, is that the implementation of this type of measures has been carried out without taking into the consideration of the public. This is something that already has been discussed in this session. We are doing and implementing these policies at the back of the people, at the back of the citizens. There are no explicit mechanisms for citizen participation for the design of the plans and these policies in question. Additionally, no major evaluation plans for the implemented technologies are being considered, nor is a substantive role assigned to the public in such evaluation stage. So we have a huge problem regarding accountability of these policies and the role of citizenship in that question. Of course, these trends are completely preliminary, but I think that it can help us to the conversation. Regarding in what way these initiatives have impact or could impact the exercise of rights by affected populations, thinking especially in groups like women, LGBTQI+, indigenous and Afro-descendant people. I think that regarding this point, we have to deal with the circumstances. And we all already know that this sort of circumstances, such as the pandemic, have highlighted dramatically the structural inequalities in society and how problematic they are when a large part of social interactions are carried out through digital media. In this sense, the implementation of this type of technological solutions can actually lead to the exaltation of such structural inequalities. Take, for instance, the boom of traceability applications to face the coronavirus, something that also was already in the table. The assumptions implicit in such developments refer to the existence of a technological infrastructure that simply does not exist in the different corners of our region. Let us think particularly in the case of communities of native peoples that inhabit rural areas, where the promise of connectivity is simply not resolved. De facto, such communities remain outside of the case of the state on the particular problem, and therefore are again invisible with respect to their particular needs. So it is possible to argue in broad terms that the assumptions that guide the supposed advantage of these technological solutions are not verifiable for all cases in Latin America. And we must mainly discuss such assumptions that, by the way, exceed the technological infrastructure and also refer to the protection of fundamental rights, such as the protection of our personal data, as we have already here in this session. So, and finally, regarding what good practices can we observe or should be adapted to mitigate the risks in the use of these systems? Again, I have here 3 points that I would like to signalize. First, ethical guidelines are not enough. This is something that we have already heard a lot of times, but it's important to highlight again. We need binding regulations for all the actors involved in this sort of system and its implication. It is imperative to configure updated regulations that can not only protect fundamental rights in the face of the application of these technologies, since and especially because we know that these applications can have and have had discriminatory effects. Above all, it is required that the norm should be accompanied by the development of state institutions and their capacities to deal with these sort of problems. This is something that Victor was also mentioning regarding the preparation of the public officers leading with such technological implementations. That is, regulation itself is not enough, especially in a region like Latin America, when we know, even from the painful colonial heritage, that it was argued that the regulations are followed, but not necessarily complied with. O como se dice en castellano, la norma se acata, pero no se cumple. Secondly, it is imperative to have mechanisms for citizen participation since the design until the evaluation of these initiatives. Until now, the model for the design and applications of these technological solutions has been bottom down. This type of design not only limits the agency of citizens, it also creates the condition of possibility for a questioning of the legitimacy in the application of this type of technology. So it's not only regarding the participation of citizenship, a matter of how the public policy is being implemented, but it's also a matter of the legitimacy behind the implementation of those policies. The third point is that, and I think that this is really important, is that we cannot lose sight of the problem of the political economy here. So the role of the private companies is fundamental for the development and implementation of these technologies, and we all know that. But it's especially important that the type of link that it's configured with the state institutions should be public and known in all circumstances. Accountability again, especially taking into account two issues. On the one hand, a large part of this type of initiatives includes the processing of personal information of millions of citizens in the region. On the other hand, most of these developments come from companies from the global north. And I know that Victor has a significant exception to that use. But this concentration of the development on this sort of applications, especially with those companies that have or may have been deeply rooted in this whole conception of surveillance capitalism, given that is absolutely necessary to prevent the reproduction of the logic of global dependency that eventually could establish this sort of dependence, this technological dependence. Finally, I just would like to point out that it's really important that we actually highlight the question about the meaning and purpose of the implementation of this type of system. That question should always be explicit and subject to public inquiry, especially when they are linked to the provision of critical services, such as access to health, justice, or education, like we all have here in this session. It is essential that we create the conditions to be able to respond democratically to what, when, and to what extent these tools can actually make a real contribution to a development with social justice in our countries. So I think that just to finish and to wrap up, I don't want to go to specific examples. I think that Carolina and Victor have already said a lot about them and their particularities. So I try to just give a broad view on this subject in order maybe to foster any questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricio, for this. I guess it has been interesting to follow up on the development of these cases, although this is work in progress. As Patricio said, we are already able to understand a bit of the trends. And one of them that I think it's interesting and dialogues with a case that Carolina brought at the beginning is this idea that first comes the implementation with different interests and actors involved in a way that is completely opaque to the public and to the public debate in general, and then an institutionalization, then regulation. So the case of the municipality of Buenos Aires that she brought regarding the use of facial recognition could be illustrative of that, although it's not one of the cases we are analyzing. It's one case in which these trends is also observed, and in that case, unfortunately, a law could be approved even after public debates, intensive public debates and public participation that was forced into this through civil society and some academic actors in the region. It could be approved and ignoring all of that. So it's kind of something that we should continue to put attention into. And regarding the discriminatory effects, these policies can have the consideration around the COVID apps is interesting. We could talk a little bit more about that in a session we had specifically on an observatory we are developing with the Al Sur Consortium, which gathers several civil society organizations from Latin America, and we're trying to document and map how these initiatives are being implemented. I guess my colleague Vladimir has shared the link for that session also, but I would invite you to follow up on that. So we have around 30 minutes for debate. We already have a question here. So I will bring the question to the panelists. This is directed to Carolina. And then I will also invite you to, while we are waiting for more questions from the audience, and I would invite people to share their questions, you can send them here through the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and Vladimir can authorize you to do it orally. But I will start with this question for Carolina. Considering your extensive experience researching about internet governance, what lessons coming from that experience could be useful to address the issues around AI governance, linked to how to provide more participatory mechanisms in design, implementation, and deployment of AI solutions by Latin American public policies? What kind of conversations we should have about the role from academia and civil society in external oversights of these policies? This was a question from Maria Paz Canales. If you want to start, Carolina, then, and please feel free to share any questions or reactions to what Patricio and Victor already said.
Thank you. Hola, Maria Paz. Thank you for the question. So I will put it again. It went to answered. So this is a very interesting challenge, and precisely we are in an internet governance forum, and we are discussing AI governance or AI governmentality in this session. And one thing that I find very, very interesting is how many, and you yourself and many of the participants that I see here in this session, we come from this internet governance field, and we are seeing that policymakers and others are also going into the debate about another general purpose technology as AI, and this equipment, this baggage we're carrying with us, our intellectual history and the instruments we have used in the past are now being tested in this with this technology with a much the concerns are much greater, because AI in a way, well, the internet is a disseminated and distributed technology, but at least in internet governance, we achieved some kind of model that is deeply studied and emulated, and even the Facebook Oversight Board looked at how ICANN worked around its steering committee or oversight mechanisms, accountability mechanisms. And with AI, we are in the process internationally, and I think also nationally, of exploring and tinkering with some of the mechanisms that were developed earlier. Institutionally, it would be impossible to replicate something like that, because this is even a more cross-cutting technology in a way that is pervasive to all the digital activities. And on the other hand, so this configuration at the international level is also being echoed at the national and the subnational level as well. So I think the more granular the debates become, I mean, the more attached to a country or even a subnational issue, that will have a greater impact. Again, I was saying originally that although I think that embracing national AI strategies or frameworks and having a multi-stakeholder discussion in its formulation, in the agenda setting process, the development and the implementation, we are still in this stalemate after 2 years where nothing much has evolved in terms of national instruments around national AI strategies. There haven't been that great many developments since 2017, 2018, when there was this spike and great interest, and then attention waned at the end of last year. So I think we will see a revived interest in this kind of approaches after the pandemic recedes, and we are already beginning to see some interest in terms of revamping this national debates around these instruments. I think it is essential to guarantee the presence of a multi-stakeholder presence and the presence of civil society, academia, and other sectors, not just in the consultative phase. They should also be involved in the design. There is or should be some kind of progression towards some oversight or some mechanism where there is more, where there is a little bit more strength in the kind of recommendations that can be provided. Again, because some of the issues that we are seeing just with campaigns are not working, and yes, so I think that we have to be firm and address the multi-stakeholder component and try to work around how these strategies at the national or subnational level even are being developed, and try to get a chance to shape this institutional mechanism, because if it starts working and we are not there, then it'll be much more difficult in the future to get a chance to change this in a way.
Thank you, Carolina. We have a comment here in the chat, but before sharing it with you, I'd like to ask if Patricio or Victor would have some thoughts on this participation issue. I know Patricio brought that in his presentation. I don't know if you have any complementary thoughts on what Carolina shared, or if you want to share questions also, please feel free to do that.
I just would like to add on this idea of having citizen participation involved in the design of these policies and systems. It's not only a matter of the application and evaluation of these programs, but it's, I will say, mostly a matter of the design and the function that is actually meant to be resolved by the application of these sort of technologies. I think that we are losing sight of the actual problem that we are pretending to solve. And we are putting first the existence of these technological solutions without the proper reflection on how can we actually address the problems that we are trying to solve.
Maybe without putting so much in the spot, maybe you could give the example of the Chilean case that we are looking into, and that I know that you know a lot, as one example of how these decisions are made and what are the priorities involved, just to make this like more concrete for people watching.
Yeah, sure. Well, in the case of Chile, we are studying an initiative called Alerta Niñez, Childhood alert. And the idea of the program is to give input to the public officers regarding the eventual affection to fundamental rights of children and teenagers. So the system, it's a predictive system that tries to rank out the chances of this child to be abused on their fundamental rights. The interesting part of the thing is how it seems to be that actually the whole configuration of this new institutionality, because that's an important point here. So this appears as an answer in the Chilean case to a huge problem regarding the safeguard of child rights. So in order to try to deal with that trouble, they propose this new institution order regarding this problem. But the interesting fact is that it seems to be that an important part of this whole new institutional design is around this technology, not around the problem that should be trying to solve. Just to make a broad a broad sketch of this whole idea.
Thank you, Patricio. We have a comment from Beatriz Barbosa, our friend from Brazil. She's sharing a case in which, well, I'll read her comment, and if you want to react or even ask for more information, it's open to you also. She's saying that in Brazil, the government launched a security plan for the elections, the municipal election, which will monitor the voting day on November 15th with the use of drones that will make facial recognition without any transparency or even information about how personal data will be used. The Rights on the Network Coalition, which brings together Brazilian organizations, submitted last week an extensive request for information about the plan, but we do not expect positive responses. It's pretty serious, and this will take place during a key day for our country. We have another question here for Victor, so I will also share this one, and you can react to both situations. I would invite you to do that. Victor, what are the inclusion challenges of technology implementation in a country particularly impacted by an armed conflict and massive migration? How different layers of vulnerability intertwine in the spread of these technologies? Taking, for example, the case of the app developed recently for providing economic support during the pandemic. That's a question also from Maria Paz Canales. If you want to start then, Victor, maybe you can react to the three questions that were commented until now. Feel free to do it the way you prefer.
So, thank you for the question. That question is indeed a complex one. And it is a complex one because even though we put forward the idea we want explainability in the systems, we don't spend that much time in explaining the technology and how this kind of technology inserts in contexts. So we disregard many times what Maria Paz was just pointing out. And there are many layers. The first had to do with the digital gap, and is common with all digital technologies. Patricio pointed out the lack of connectivity in certain regions, which means straightforward, not accessing a solution and not being reflected in the data of the solution. So it's a double impact, both in access, use, and benefit of the technology, and how the reality is overshowing part of the population and straightforward missing a different part of the population, which is most of the times vulnerable population for other reasons. So you had that first level, which is the one that has to do with the digital gap. A second level that is interesting is building up the capabilities of all the layers of population. That is to say, which are the populations that are participating in these debates? and that participate in the very, very small spaces that are put forward to debate these issues. And these populations you just pointed out are usually excluded. To make an example, to put forward an example, the ethical framework for AI in Colombia, the document for such a framework put forward to comments by the presidency was put forward in a website. The format of the text is not accessible at all. You could not look for a certain text. How it was presented was not easy to navigate with low connectivity. And the only way of commenting was commenting via the email. So you have tons of people that are not commenting there. They are just excluded. And on the other hand, not only they are not commenting, that is a very feeble or weak participatory process. And interesting enough, such text was mainly a translation of the knowledge from the United States, which also links to the idea that Patricia and Carolina also comment on the knowledge being built also in our region. So I think that to sum up the idea is that the reality of Colombia is very diverse, but the reality to which that is taken into consideration for the design, development, and deployment, and to which it is being applied is a totally different reality. And in that regard, I think it's very interesting to use this kind of systems for a different functionality to that of which they were developed for. I mean, the criminality prediction systems, they are interesting also to be used to analyze the reality they are showing, and to contrast the reality those systems are showing with the reality we know from other sources, from sources that analyze inequality, from sources that analyze diversity, and just to use them to contrast and to take a grasp of the importance of these differences and the gaps of the realities itself and their complexity, and the realities reflected and used by these systems. I don't know if I answered to that question a little bit, but I would just like to jump into the idea of the question of Carolina. Governance in these systems is so complex in my point of view, because I really believe we are disregarding in the public debate the complexity of the systems themselves. I mean, just to put forward an example, we talk about discrimination of these systems, but the discrimination of the effects may come from different sources, from the interpretation of the human actor taking the outcome, from the reality itself being discriminatory, from the digital divide and the gaps in connectivity, use, and benefit, from the practices themselves by which the data is produced. For instance, police data usually reflect the police practices, which overreact in certain places and not in others, and invisibilize, omit some kind of crimes. For instance, because the actions that are more taken into consideration are those violence and non-white collar. So that is also a source that may produce a discriminatory effect. So in my belief, as far as we are not building up capabilities in the general population to understand these complexities, because these complexities define the solutions and how to engage them, the formal spaces open to participation lack the substantial capabilities of general population, including, of course, myself not being a techie.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you so much for also this typology and these considerations. I guess we have 15 minutes now, and I will share a question that has arrived and that seems very interesting to also allow you to give your final considerations. So I will open 5 minutes to each of you, so we will end up with this question. The question comes from Matias Valderrama. He says, thank you very much for the presentations. Just a reaction. I believe that we should not only worry about dependency relationships with innovation poles in the global north, but also inequalities between local and state governments. I'm thinking of cases in which the richest municipalities are those that buy these technologies without further regulation or public discussion, partly because of tremendous budget they have compared to other municipalities. And I would like to ask, how do you see the idea of prohibiting the development of certain ADMs in sensitive issues or areas, considering that some companies have stopped the development of facial recognition, for example? So I will open to Carolina, if you can react to both things that he brings. I know that you have touched a bit on this in your first interaction, but also invite you to make your final considerations.
Yes, thank you. So again, such a technology and the adoption at a massive scale or in the public interest or for vulnerable communities, we have to think that this is not in these technologies that might be sometimes important, many times are important, but which have different layers. We can have an important layer at some at the infrastructure and maybe at the protocol level, but then we need to feed in the data. We need the people to address those issues. So it's an ecology that it's actually very complex, and that even though it might be imported, there is a human factor, and there is a decision from a local actor. And here, this is the challenge, but also the opportunity we have, because the inclusion of these types of technologies does not exist in an epistemic or an institutional vacuum, and because the institutional ecosystem around this issue is still being shaped or could be absorbed by existing agencies within national governments or within respective agencies, the time to sort of shape it is now. The time to sort of address these issues is very much now, and not expect or not wait for others to come and develop this agenda. I think in this respect, and a little bit reflecting again on Maria Paz's first comment, I mean, there is this opportunity of being the early starters in the race, okay, and this is relevant. And what Matthias is bringing in here is precisely this kind of the inclusion of these technologies is not in a vacuum. We won't be seeing the poorest municipalities in Latin America trying to engage in this kind of technologies. We are seeing it's the richest, largest cities. It's Buenos Aires, it's Sao Paulo, it's Rio de Janeiro, it's Bogota, or the ministries in Bogota, Sisben. I mean, we are seeing all those in national capitals. We are seeing that this technology is beginning to flow and being developed by these, or at least the idea of attracting this technology initially is being developed in capitals, and so there is this very much a subnational divide in terms of the expectations of why we need this technology, why should this be developed, and again there is. I think that there's an opportunity for civil society, for academia, probably because we are included in a more global epistemic debate about this issue, to bring a more informed perspective about this, because sometimes policymakers are just knocked at the doors by the industry, and that's what happens. I mean, it's or opaque trade agreements and the exchange of some technologies in exchange for raw materials, and we have actually very little information about why that technological cooperation takes place, etc. And I don't want to talk about nations and big powers and their influence in Latin America now, but I mean it's definitely something of concern to try to get more information and more accountability from governments in their scientific cooperation and historically the trade agreements as well, but with scientific cooperation, it's something that we really have to bear in mind what is at stake in some of these exchanges or ideas that are coming through. These are my first comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Carolina, and thank you again for joining us and sharing all these thoughts. Victor, if you want to follow up.
Then I will engage the second part of the question of Matthias, which is, if I remember correctly, is the possibility of forbidding some sort of technologies of uses. I agree with forbidding some ways of engaging these technologies. The one that was put forward in the European Union, forbidding the decision making without a human actor. I totally agree with that, but I think it has to be complemented with what I said before about building up capabilities. That is, the human actor that is using the system has to understand what the system is really saying and how it's saying it and why, in the context. Otherwise, it's just a way of a human convalidating a decision by a system that may or may not be discriminating, and that renders the provision of forbidding the decisions without human actor useless. As for forbidding some certain technologies or the moratory, that's an idea that is being put forward with the technologies used by police to predict crime, Predpool mainly. And as is one of the examples I said of denouncing a certain technology instead of a certain use of a certain system. That's a very complex possibility because, on my point of view, because actually what lies below is the problem of the reality the system is being applied to, which is a discriminatory reality in which certain parts of population live in certain areas of the city. Because many of these times, even the race as a variable is not taken into consideration in the system. There are the proxy variables that put forward unevocable to those race differences. So I could be for thinking out the moratorium on certain technologies, as far as we also engage in the conversation of why we have to put that moratorium on, because the problem is the reality underlying. So, and this is one of my two final ideas. I don't know if it is possible to engage a non-discriminatory in their effects automatic decision systems if we don't engage seriously with inequalities and the digital divide. I mean, I believe they cannot be separated one to the other. And with that being said, I would like to, as my final second comment, and in line with that, what Carolina just said, I think we have to increase the capabilities of the public sector, because the risk is, one, big companies coming and saying and defining the problem on the basis of what they want to sell and the economic interests, which is legitimate. I mean, big companies live for that, for the profit. And there is some certain of doubt that the public entities have to have when a big company comes and say, I have this solution for you, but my interests as a public officer are different than yours as a big company. So I need to be able to question what you are offering me, not to just say no, just to question what you're offering and maybe shaping it. And the second reason we I think public officers' capabilities need to be built up is because of the concept of domain expert. As Carolina said before, artificial intelligence can be used in every other field. And there are different fields with different realities, different contexts, different variables to take into consideration, different correlation and causal relations. So the public officer, as a domain expert, has to be able to communicate this expertise to the scientists and mathematicians that are developing the model. Otherwise, we have to be faithful that these experts in science and mathematics has also some certain domain knowledge so they can shape to the reality and the context. And with that regard, 5 minutes exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. This is an excellent point. The final point that you bring in is also something that we are trying to develop in the context of this research project. I'll give the floor to Patricio then for your final intervention.
Well, I'd just like to point out to two main things that have been mentioned by Carolina and Victor. This whole idea that we are dealing with a new complexity, with a new complex, I will say, like socio-technical ecology that entails a new layer upon reality. That new layer will not hide, or may hide, but will not affect strictly the structural inequalities that lies beyond that layer. So we have to address that as well. And in that matter, I think that what Victor was saying regarding the importance to understand this complexity give us as a civil society organization, and also in the academia as well, a huge task and a huge thing to deal with, which is the labor of sort of dealing with some process of translation in order to open this discussion to the public. So I think that's something more broad that I would like to point out just to the end. And regarding the question of Matthias, yeah, for sure, this whole thing regarding inequalities, it's clearly noted in which sort of municipalities or districts in our region are actually have the material the material capabilities to actually pay for these technologies, and that again highlights this gap that I was referring previously. But regarding the idea of prohibiting some sort of technologies, I will say that, so first of all, and I would like to take account the comment made by Carolina in the chat as well. It's not only a matter of the technology itself, but it's also the matter of how this technology is being used and to what ends or purposes it's being oriented to. So if we can evaluate this whole thing, we can actually, I would say, try to deal with this complexity that we were referring previously. So if we made those reflections, we also have to take into account that it had been interesting, like why, for instance, the way that the outgoing rapporteur on freedom of expression has been invited to a moratorium on the sort of technologies related with facial recognition for uses of surveillance. So that we have a connection with not only the technology, but also the use that is being proposed. So it's not actually only about AI, but actually the thing is how we can sort of extend this some sort of precautionary principle to another kind of activities. But I will insist, it's not only a matter of technological devices, it's the socio-technical complex that lies behind of them and the implication that has in our everyday life. That process and its translation, I think that it's very complex and we have a huge part to deal with it.
Thank you, Patricio. Thanks so much. And I guess with that, we can finalize this session with this idea of bringing some complexities to this debate. I guess you were all very precise in trying to do that and trying to get this debate to another level, and at the same time bringing our local Latin American voices to this debate that in certain spaces is being led, is being taken by voices from other regions, and without as much concrete evidence or documentation on what's going on here in our countries. So I thank you all for joining us today. I will invite you to continue following up these discussions on the use of data-intensive technologies during the IGF, the use of automated decision systems during the IGF. I know there are several sessions with this topic, and also invite you to follow Derechos Digitales social media channels. We will be sharing the results of this research very soon. So I hope you can keep following up on that. And thank you, Patricio, Carolina, and Victor for joining us today. We hope we can continue discussing this.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you so much to everybody. Sí, para los panelistas,